This is the story of two empires of chaos, one built on ideological terror, the other on drug profits that merged their forces in a secret, devastating partnership. It began not in the mountains of Afghanistan or the jungles of Colombia, but on a hidden route across the Atlantic, Highway 10. For years, investigators tracked a phantom maritime corridor carrying multi-ton loads of cocaine, but they could never identify the protection detail. That is, until the DEA uncovered a chilling, explicit financial transaction. The FARC, the world's most sophisticated drug cartel, was paying a direct tax to Al-Qaeda. This series pulls back the curtain on the Narco-Terror Nexus, detailing the undercover operation, the landmark indictment in New York, and the global fallout of the most profitable, self-sustaining hybrid threat the world has ever seen. For decades, the global drug trade operated on a rigid north-south axis: cocaine from South America, heroin from Asia, destined for the rich markets of Europe and North America. But in the early 2000s, a new, highly militarized route emerged, fundamentally changing the risk profile of the transnational drug trade. This route, codenamed Highway 10 by some analysts, followed the 10th parallel north, cutting straight across the Atlantic from the Caribbean and South American coasts directly to West Africa. The destination was not a primary market, but a massive, unsecured staging post. The emergence of the African route was a direct response to increasing interdiction efforts in the Caribbean and Central America. The FARC, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, facing unprecedented pressure on their traditional smuggling paths, needed a new, high-volume, low-risk maritime corridor to reach their primary target market, Europe. West Africa offered the perfect environment. Thousands of miles of unguarded coastline, pervasive governmental corruption, and limited naval enforcement capacity. Ships, often converted fishing trawlers or older commercial vessels, would depart the Caribbean and, after a 2-week voyage, rendezvous off the coast of countries like Guinea-Bissau or Mauritania. The sheer volume of cocaine being moved was staggering. At its peak, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, estimated that 30 to 40 tons of cocaine worth billions of dollars on the European street was transiting through West Africa annually. But moving tons of white powder into politically unstable regions required security. That's where the ideologues of terror entered the equation. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, operating across the vast ungoverned desert space of the Sahel, saw the drug trade not as an ideological distraction, but as a multi-billion-dollar business opportunity. AQIM's regional affiliates specialized in kidnapping and extortion, but the drug trade offered a reliable, industrial-scale revenue stream. They controlled the land routes that spanned the Sahara, the ancient Saharan trade routes, and possessed the vehicles, weapons, and local knowledge to guarantee safe passage. The FARC needed secure transit from the coast to the Mediterranean-bound ports in North Africa. AQIM needed financing to execute their attacks and sustain their territorial control. The partnership was one of pure commerce. The FARC paid for protection, and Al-Qaeda provided the armed force. This commercial agreement created a cocaine superhighway, a corridor of crime and terror that stretched from the jungles of South America to the consumption centers of Europe, with the African Sahel as its militarized toll booth. This was the moment the world's largest drug cartel and one of the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations formally merged their logistics, creating a self-financing entity that would fuel global instability for a decade. The investigation began with a single, highly suspicious wire transfer linking a known FARC operative to an unknown African network, a transfer that pointed directly to the first major arrest. The flow of cocaine across the Atlantic required a facilitator, a figure who could bridge the gap between Latin American cartels and the tribal militias of the African desert. That figure was Haruna Touré. A man with a chilling reputation, Touré was not just a broker, he was the human nexus, the one who negotiated the terror tax and guaranteed that FARC's money would flow directly to Al-Qaeda. Haruna Touré was an ideal intermediary for the emerging narco-terror network. Originally from Mali, he possessed a complex web of contacts that spanned the traditional criminal underworld of West Africa, the black markets of the Middle East, and the shadowy world of extremist finance. He had a reputation for being ruthless, efficient, and most importantly, trustworthy within the circles of both the drug cartels and the militant organizations. Touré was the critical link that allowed the FARC to bypass localized, unorganized criminals and secure a professional, militarized protection racket. His operational model was simple. He positioned himself as the sole guarantor of high-value transit through the most volatile regions of the Sahel. While the cocaine arrived on the coast, moving it thousands of miles across the vast, arid interior required more than just fast cars. It required a private army with deep desert knowledge and political impunity. Touré's pitch to the FARC was straightforward. Pay my security forces, and your product moves unmolested. Fail to pay, and your shipment disappears. His security forces, he openly boasted, were none other than the regional franchise of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. The price Touré negotiated became the chilling signature of the Nexus, $2,000 per kilogram of cocaine. This was not a standard transport fee. It was a non-negotiable tax, explicitly designated for the terrorist group. This single figure turned an illegal drug transaction into an act of terror financing, making every kilogram moved a direct investment in global jihad. DEA and specialized counter-terror units in Europe began to track Touré through intercepted communications and financial data, building a mosaic of his extensive network that spanned Ghana, Mali, Niger, and beyond. Touré's genius lay in his ability to blend into the legitimate world while orchestrating global crime. He used front companies, legitimate-sounding names, and complex financial instruments to mask his activities. However, his boasts were his downfall. In recorded conversations with undercover DEA sources, Touré repeatedly bragged about his access to the most violent terrorist commanders, detailing how the money from the FARC was used to purchase arms, recruit fighters, and fuel the anti-Western agenda of AQIM. These conversations were not vague. They were explicit, outlining a joint operational venture where the FARC provided the product and Al-Qaeda provided the force. His eventual capture was the result of a coordinated international sting operation designed not to seize the drugs, but to secure the explicit recorded evidence of the terror financing conspiracy. Touré was caught in a trap set by an anonymous DEA confidential source known only as CS1, who posed as a high-level FARC representative seeking to formalize the transatlantic route. The meeting, which took place in Ghana, produced the irrefutable audio and documentary evidence that would form the basis of a historic indictment, finally giving a face to the organizational core of the narco-terror nexus. His arrest was the key that unlocked the next layer of the conspiracy: the physical security force on the ground. If Haruna Touré was the network CEO, then Idris Abdelrahman was its chief of security. Abdelrahman was the militia commander who delivered on Touré's promise, a desert army whose sole function was to protect the cocaine convoys. His methods were brutal. His allegiance was to Al-Qaeda, and his control over the deep desert routes was absolute, making him the physical embodiment of the terror-for-profit partnership. Idris Abdelrahman represented the militarized reality of the cocaine superhighway. While Touré handled the high-level financial and political negotiations, Abdelrahman controlled the physical security of the shipments once they left the relatively secure coastal zones and plunged into the vast, lawless expanses of the Sahel. He was a hardened militia leader with deep ties to AQIM and other Salafi jihadist groups operating in the border regions of Mali, Niger, and Mauritania. His reputation as a ruthless enforcer was legendary and served as a powerful deterrent to rival traffickers and local military patrols alike. Abdelrahman's forces were professional and well-equipped, a direct result of the continuous funding stream provided by the FARC's cocaine money. Unlike simple bandits, his militia operated with military-grade precision, utilizing technicals, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, satellite communication, and advanced counter-surveillance tactics. His primary responsibility was to ensure that the multi-ton shipments of FARC cocaine, which had been offloaded from the Atlantic route, made the perilous journey inland toward the northern transshipment points where they could be moved across the Mediterranean into Europe. The logistics of the operation were complex, requiring multiple shifts in vehicles, drivers, and security escorts, often dictated by the shifting political and military landscape of the Sahel. Abdelrahman's deep knowledge of the terrain, combined with his network of corrupted local officials, allowed his convoys to move undetected across international boundaries. His men not only guarded the cocaine against theft, but also actively fought pitched battles against rival criminal organizations that sought to disrupt the monopoly established by the FARC Al-Qaeda partnership. The drug profits were literally buying territorial control in the desert, transforming AQIM from a group reliant on charity and kidnapping into a self-financing military logistical powerhouse. In recorded conversations obtained by the DEA, Haruna Toure explicitly identified Abdelrahman as the man who controls the desert, confirming that the $2,000 per kilogram protection fee was funneled directly to Abdelrahman's forces. This was the irrefutable evidence that federal prosecutors needed. The money was not just going to an African partner, but specifically to a designated foreign terrorist organization for the explicit purpose of securing a high-value drug shipment. Abdelrahman's arrest, which followed Toure's, was a critical blow to the network's operational capacity, removing the man responsible for the physical security of the entire superhighway. The capture of Abdelrahman was a testament to the success of Operation Relentless, the DEA's concerted effort to dismantle the narco-terror nexus. Without his militarized protection, the efficiency and security of the cocaine superhighway would drastically decrease, making the FARC's reliance on the West African route a far more volatile and less profitable proposition. His indictment served as the crucial physical evidence that transformed the investigation from a case of mere financial conspiracy into a full-scale narco-terrorism prosecution. The next logical step for investigators was to track the source of the protection money, the FARC itself. The FARC was not merely a band of rebels, they were a cartel, the primary producer of the world's highest quality cocaine. Facing a saturated North American market and intensified U.S. interdiction efforts, they needed a new high-profit destination. That quest led them across the Atlantic, where the European market promised massive returns, but only if they could secure a safe passage through the most dangerous landmass on Earth. The Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, or FARC, spent decades perfecting the art of cocaine production. They controlled vast swathes of jungle territory in Colombia, establishing secure coca fields, refining laboratories, and sophisticated logistical networks. Their operation was industrial, reliable, and capable of producing multi-ton quantities of high-purity cocaine, the necessary product to fuel the global drug trade. However, by the early 2000s, their traditional export routes were becoming increasingly vulnerable. The pressure from U.S. and Colombian counter-narcotics efforts made the Central American and Caribbean corridors prohibitively risky and expensive. The European market, by contrast, offered a massive untapped opportunity. Europe's appetite for cocaine was rapidly increasing, and the street value per kilogram was significantly higher than in the United States, often reaching upwards of 80,000 euros. This guaranteed profit margin was the key incentive that drove the FARC to innovate their logistics. They needed a route that was geographically remote, politically vulnerable, and capable of handling massive volume. The Atlantic West African-European connection was born out of this pure commercial necessity. The decision to partner with terror was a calculated business move. The FARC had a history of forming tactical alliances with organized crime groups for protection and logistics, but the link with Al-Qaeda marked a dangerous escalation. They were not just paying local thugs, they were actively funding an enemy of the West. Their representatives, who negotiated the deal with Haruna Toure, understood the nature of the transaction. The $2,000 per kilogram fee was a form of political insurance. It bought them the ultimate security detail, a well-armed, highly motivated desert army with an ideological cover that made them even more formidable to local authorities. The partnership with AQIM allowed the FARC to transform a potential logistical nightmare, the Trans-Saharan Traverse, into a highly reliable, militarized superhighway. Their operational design was brilliant. Move the product from the lab to the coast of Venezuela, ship it across the Atlantic to Guinea-Bissau, then let AQIM's desert forces move it inland to the North African ports for final shipment into Europe. This strategy outsourced the highest-risk phase of transit to the terror group, allowing the FARC to focus on production and finance. The investigation, which initially focused on the African brokers, quickly had to pivot back to the source: the FARC's financial and logistical representatives. Intelligence revealed that the FARC was deeply embedded in the planning, using their own financial officers to arrange the payments through complex, layered transactions designed to obscure the final recipient, the terror group. The success of the initial arrests proved that the DEA could successfully disrupt the African end of the chain, but the ongoing flow of cocaine meant the source, the FARC's operational core, remained active and profitable. The next crucial step was to use the intelligence gathered from the arrests to understand the financial instruments that transferred the funds. To successfully prosecute a drug dealer for funding Al-Qaeda, investigators needed a new legal weapon. The traditional charges were insufficient for the gravity of the crime. The U.S. Justice Department's solution was to leverage the power of conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism, a powerful statute that allowed federal prosecutors to officially merge the two spheres of crime and ideology in a single, devastating indictment. The arrest of Haruna Touré and Idris Abdelrahman presented the U.S. government with a unique legal challenge. While the defendants were clearly involved in drug trafficking, that crime alone did not capture the threat they posed to global security. The evidence gathered by the DEA's Operation Relentless explicitly proved that the defendants' intent was to use the drug profits to finance a designated foreign terrorist organization, FTO, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. To reflect the severity of this hybrid crime, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York decided to use the charge of conspiracy to provide material support to an FTO, specifically utilizing the legal concept of narco-terrorism. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 and subsequent legislation provided the legal framework necessary to link the financial crime of drug trafficking directly to the ideological threat of terrorism. This approach was revolutionary. Prosecutors did not need to prove that the cocaine physically reached American shores, only that the defendants conspired to import it, and crucially, that the proceeds would be used to support an organization whose goal was to attack U.S. interests and citizens. The key was establishing the explicit, knowing intent of the defendants. The audio recordings secured by the confidential source, CS1, became the bedrock of the legal case. Haruna Touré's explicit boasts about the $2,000 per kilogram terror tax and his detailed descriptions of AQIM's security role provided irrefutable proof of intent. The money was not merely a byproduct, it was the material support that allowed AQIM to function, recruit, and arm itself. This legal maneuver allowed the U.S. government to apply the full weight of counterterrorism statutes, including enhanced sentencing, asset forfeiture, and international cooperation mandates against individuals who traditionally would have faced lighter drug sentences. The use of the narco-terrorism charge sent a powerful message globally. Any criminal enterprise that knowingly partners with a terrorist organization would be treated as a terrorist organization itself. This move was designed to be a significant deterrent to other trafficking groups who might be considering similar alliances. It effectively doubled the risk profile of the criminal terror hybrid, making the FARC's business decision to pay the AQIM tax a catastrophic strategic error for their partners. The entire legal strategy was a testament to the interagency cooperation between the DEA, the Department of Justice, and the intelligence community. It required specialized legal counsel to navigate the complex international jurisdiction issues and the rules of evidence collection in a high-stakes undercover operation spanning multiple continents. The resulting indictment was not just a legal document, it was an intelligence blueprint that mapped the entire operational and financial nexus between the South American cartel and the African terror cell. The success of this legal innovation would determine the future of how hybrid threats were prosecuted worldwide, and it began by tracking a specific document that confirmed the alliance. The high-stakes undercover operation was nearing its climax, but federal prosecutors needed one final piece of evidence to connect the African brokers directly to the FARC's source of cocaine. That proof came in the form of a single secret document, a detailed handwritten ledger outlining the financial agreement, confirming the explicit partnership and the designated terror tax. It was the smoking gun that finalized the conspiracy. The successful arrests of Haruna Touré and Idris Abdelrahman provided a treasure trove of intelligence, including electronic devices, travel logs, and the critical audio recordings. However, to solidify the case beyond a reasonable doubt, especially concerning the FARC's direct operational involvement, the prosecution needed a hard copy, a physical document that detailed the financial mechanics of the Nexus. This document was the ultimate confirmation, the final piece of the puzzle connecting the South American source to the African threat. This secret document, a ledger or manifest seized during the arrests, meticulously detailed the operational structure of the agreement. It outlined the agreed-upon shipment sizes, the coordinates of the transfer points in the Sahel, and most critically, the breakdown of the financial distribution. The ledger explicitly noted a recurring charge that corresponded precisely to the $2,000 per kilogram protection fee mentioned in the recorded conversations. It served as a binding financial contract between the FARC's representatives and Touré's network, explicitly confirming the fund's designation for the security provided by the desert militias. The ledger was the final verification that the deal was not a vague, verbal arrangement, but a formalized multi-million-dollar business partnership. It showed that the FARC was fully aware that a significant portion of their sales revenue was being funneled to Al-Qaeda. This document was crucial because it preemptively undermined any defense argument that the African brokers were merely independent contractors who incidentally paid off terrorists. The ledger proved the operational intent was baked into the pricing structure from the outset. The seizure and analysis of this document were the crowning achievement of the DEA's Financial Intelligence Unit, a specialized component of the Special Operations Division, SOD, responsible for tracing the complex money trail of narco-terror groups. They were able to cross-reference the ledger's entries with the FARC's known operational capacity and the intercepted financial transactions, creating an unassailable record of the conspiracy. This document became the cornerstone of the unsealed indictment filed in the Southern District of New York, transforming the case from a high-stakes intelligence operation into a legally airtight prosecution. The importance of the secret document went beyond the trial. It provided global intelligence agencies with an unprecedented look at the inner financial workings of a hybrid criminal terror organization. It confirmed the cost of doing business with global terror and provided a baseline for tracking similar financial patterns in other regions. With this document in hand, the U.S. Justice Department was ready to proceed with the historic legal action. The next step was the public unveiling of this evidence in the unsealed indictment, a document that would shock the world and lay out the complete map of the terror alliance. The arrest of Haruna Touré and Idris Abdelrahman was a tactical victory. But the real prize was the document that followed, the unsealed indictment from the Southern District of New York. This legal paper, often seen as dry boilerplate, was in fact the Rosetta Stone for a new form of global crime. It explicitly named the FARC and Al-Qaeda as business partners, laying out the logistics of their partnership for the world to see. The unsealed indictment filed by the Department of Justice in the Southern District of New York in 2009 was not just a list of charges, it was an unprecedented intelligence briefing. Under the title, United States of America v. Umar Issa, Haruna Touré, and Idris Abdelrahman, the charges detailed a conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism, a powerful legal weapon that allowed federal prosecutors to link the financial crimes of drug trafficking directly to the ideological threat of terrorism. The document meticulously transcribed the chilling boasts of the defendants, providing irrefutable evidence of the operational and financial nexus between the South American drug suppliers and the extremist security forces in the Sahel. For investigators, the indictment served as a detailed blueprint. It confirmed that the FARC was not merely selling cocaine to independent traffickers who incidentally paid off Al-Qaeda. The FARC representatives were actively seeking the specific security guarantees offered by a terror-affiliated network. The legal document outlined meetings in Ghana where the defendants explicitly bragged about their ties to Al-Qaeda's regional franchise, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. Haruna Touré, the broker, detailed the non-negotiable price of protection: $2,000 per kilogram of cocaine, an industrial-scale revenue stream guaranteed to fuel terror operations. The case was spearheaded by a specialized unit within the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, often referred to as the Special Operations Division, SOD, which focused on dismantling global narco-terror organizations. This particular investigation, given the codename Operation Relentless, used confidential informants who successfully infiltrated the highest levels of the African trafficking network. The DEA's strategy was designed to catch the criminals in the act of facilitating a direct transaction with a foreign terrorist organization, thus securing the maximum possible charges under U.S. law. The physical evidence cited in the indictment included seized communication devices, logs of travel, and, most critically, recorded conversations in which the defendants confirmed their intent to facilitate the transit of cocaine while providing financial and material support to AQIM. The indictment detailed the proposed routes, establishing the existence of a high-volume corridor, the cocaine superhighway, that leveraged the lack of state control across the vast territories of Mali, Niger, and Mauritania. This was the documentation of a logistical partnership, where Al-Qaeda provided security and tax collection, and the FARC provided the source material for the revenue. The very existence of the indictment sent shockwaves through both the FARC and global terrorist organizations. It signaled a new era of legal strategy. The U.S. government was prepared to use its full weight of anti-terrorism law against drug traffickers, recognizing the economic truth that the two enterprises had merged. By labeling the drug money as terrorism finance, it opened the door for freezing assets, seizing international shipments, and applying severe pressure on allied nations to cooperate in extraditing those involved. The immediate consequence of the indictment was the international manhunt for the defendants and the intense focus it brought to West Africa. This single legal document validated years of intelligence, suggesting that the Sahel region was transforming from a transit zone for localized contraband into a critical militarized hub for global terror financing. The indictment was the first time that the FARC's multi-billion-dollar cocaine machine was formally linked in a U.S. court to the funding of Al-Qaeda's extremist violence. The next key figure to emerge from this legal fallout was the undercover agent who risked everything to gather the damning evidence now contained within those court files. The indictment was built on recorded conversations and seized documents. These were gathered by an anonymous DEA confidential source, a figure known in the case only as CS1. This agent spent months infiltrating the upper echelons of the West African trafficking networks, facing down men who boasted of their ties to terror. Their work, codenamed Operation Relentless, made the arrests possible. The success of the U.S. case against Touré and Abdelrahman hinged entirely on the bravery and skill of a DEA confidential source, designated for legal protection as CS1. This individual was not a law enforcement officer, but a highly placed informant within the international criminal underworld, leveraging existing relationships to gain access to the most dangerous figures operating on the West African cocaine superhighway. CS1's mission was simple but deadly: pose as a representative of the FARC, negotiate the mass transport of cocaine through the Sahel, and secure explicit, recorded assurances that the proceeds would directly fund Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups. Working under the operational umbrella of the DEA's Special Operations Division, CS1 traveled to volatile locations, including Ghana, where the crucial meeting with Haruna Touré took place. The risk was astronomical. Any slip-up, any sign that they were recording the transactions or acting as an informant, would have resulted in immediate torture and execution by a network that defined itself by its brutality. The psychological toll of sitting across a table from a man like Touré, who openly spoke of his allegiance to a terrorist organization and their shared goal of attacking the West, cannot be overstated. The key piece of evidence secured by CS1 was the verbal confirmation of the $2,000 per kilogram protection fee. This wasn't a standard transportation charge. It was a designated tax for a security detail guaranteed by Al-Qaeda. The informant's audio recordings captured Touré and his co-conspirator, Umar Issa, detailing the precise logistics. The meeting points in Mali or Niger, the rugged, militarized convoys necessary for the trans-Saharan run, and the handoff to the desert militia led by Idris Abdelrahman. These tapes transcended mere drug charges. They were direct proof of providing material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. The DEA agents directing CS1 from a distance had to navigate complex diplomatic and legal landscapes. The operation spanned multiple jurisdictions in West Africa, necessitating sensitive communication with local police forces and intelligence agencies, many of whom were rife with the very corruption the traffickers relied upon. Maintaining CS-1's cover while ensuring their safety required a continuous, high-stakes logistical ballet, a testament to the dedication of the entire DEA team. The payoff came with the successful arrest of the defendants. The Operation Relentless did more than just capture 3 high-value targets. It provided the U.S. government with the foundational intelligence needed to pursue the entire narco-terror financing chain. It established a model for infiltrating and prosecuting other hybrid organizations where profit and ideology were inextricably linked. The successful execution of the sting operation exposed the myth that terrorists and drug traffickers operated in entirely separate spheres, forcing a global re-evaluation of security policy. The captured recordings and the integrity of CS-1's testimony became the bedrock of the prosecution. Without this individual's willingness to step into the heart of the conspiracy and secure the necessary confessions, the entire case might have remained circumstantial. The unsealed indictment, the arrest of the brokers, and the revelation of the Al-Qaeda funding mechanism all flowed from the calculated risks taken by a single undercover agent operating under the most extreme pressure. The next step was the complex legal battle to bring justice to the men who had merged drug money with global terror. The men of the Desert Nexus, Haruna Touré, Umar Issa, and Idris Abdelrahman, were extradited from West Africa to stand trial in the United States. The destination: the federal courthouse in the Southern District of New York. The trial became an unprecedented showcase, forcing the secretive world of narco-terror financing out of the shadows and onto the public stage of American justice, confirming the links between the FARC and Al-Qaeda. The arrival of the defendants in a New York courtroom marked a pivotal moment in the global war on terror and drugs. After being successfully tracked, arrested, and extradited under the auspices of Operation Relentless, the accused faced trial in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. The setting was deliberate. The U.S. Justice Department sought to prove that crimes committed thousands of miles away on the smuggling routes of West Africa had a direct, prosecutable impact on American security and interests. The core of the prosecution's case rested on the charges of conspiracy to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization, AQIM, and conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States. The synergy of these charges was key. They did not need to prove that the cocaine physically reached American shores. They only needed to prove the intent and the agreement to use the profits to fund a group designated as a foreign terrorist organization. This innovative legal strategy reflected the new reality of asymmetrical threats. The financial engine of terrorism was often crime, not ideology alone. The most compelling evidence presented was the trove of material collected by CS-1, the audio recordings of the defendants detailing the logistics and the clear, unambiguous statements about their allegiance and financial support to AQIM. Haruna Touré's own words, boasting of his connections and the designated terror tax on the cocaine, were played for the jury, stripping away any pretense of a simple commercial drug transaction. The presentation of Idris Abdelrahman's role as the armed leader of the Desert Security Detail further militarized the prosecution's narrative, painting a picture of a cartel-level operation backed by a terror army. The trial also served to educate the public and the international community on the financial mechanics of narco-terror. The testimony detailed how the $2,000 per kilogram fee, a seemingly bureaucratic figure, translated into millions of dollars annually for Al-Qaeda's regional operations. This money was crucial for AQIM, allowing them to purchase arms, recruit fighters, and extend their territorial control across the Sahel, threatening the fragile stability of countries like Mali and Niger. Ultimately, the prosecution succeeded in establishing the unprecedented convergence. The defendants were found guilty of multiple counts of narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. The verdicts were more than just convictions. They were a definitive legal statement that the FARC's cocaine trade and Al-Qaeda's financial apparatus were one and the same. The sentences handed down were severe, reflecting the gravity of crossing the line from drug trafficker to terror financier. The legal precedent set by this trial was immense. It empowered international law enforcement to pursue traffickers using anti-terror statutes, creating a powerful disincentive for other criminal organizations considering similar partnerships. The case proved that a dedicated undercover operation, backed by the political will of the U.S. Justice Department, could reach across continents to dismantle the command structure of the world's most dangerous hybrid criminal networks. But while the individuals were behind bars, the money that fueled their enterprise remained at large. The convictions of the narco-terror defendants were secure, but the flow of money continued. The millions earned from the cocaine superhighway needed to be moved from Europe's ports back to the terror training camps in the Sahel, circumventing traditional banking systems. They relied on an ancient, untraceable system of trust and ledger entries, the Hawala network. The profits from the FARC's cocaine, once it reached the European market and was sold by the distributors in cities like Madrid, Amsterdam, and London, were astronomical. A single kilogram sold for up to 80,000 euros. This created a massive problem for the criminal network. How to convert millions of euros into usable currency, like US dollars or local West African CFA francs, and transport it safely and secretly across multiple continents and conflict zones without triggering global anti-money laundering mechanisms. The solution lay in the Hawala system, an informal value transfer method that originated in South Asia and the Middle East centuries ago. Hawala, meaning transfer or trust, bypasses banks entirely. It works through a network of brokers known as Hawaladars, who operate on honor and reputation. A drug distributor in Europe hands over a sum of cash, for example, euros, to a local Hawaladar. The European Hawaladar then contacts his counterpart in West Africa or the Middle East and instructs them to pay an equivalent amount in the local currency to a designated recipient, for example, a militant group. No physical money moves across borders. The transaction is settled later, often through complex debt exchanges involving gold, diamonds, or other high-value commodities. This system was perfectly suited to the narco-terror nexus. It was fast, anonymous, and left virtually no paper trail for law enforcement to follow, making it the ideal conduit for converting the FARC's drug profits into Al-Qaeda's operational budget. The indictment documents hinted at the use of these informal networks, as the money flowed seamlessly from the European drug buyers, back through North Africa, and into the Sahel, funding everything from weapons caches to recruiting efforts. The money was not just used for traditional military expenses. The drug profits were also channeled into corruption, providing bribes to low-paid border agents, customs officials, and politicians in fragile West African states. This systemic corruption ensured the long-term viability of the trafficking routes, creating what were essentially narco-states, where criminal influence rivaled that of the legitimate government. This was a critical component of the terror financing model, using cash to buy stability and impunity for the drug routes. The investigators discovered that these funds were also used to finance the acquisition of arms. In exchange for protecting the cocaine, Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Sahel received hard currency that they could use to purchase military-grade weaponry through the same illicit networks that moved the drugs and people. This established a lethal feedback loop. FARC cocaine funded the terror groups, and the terror groups in turn militarized the trade routes, making them safer for the FARC and more dangerous for everyone else. The Hawala system demonstrated the profound difficulty of fighting a decentralized, hybrid financial enemy. While the United States could indict and imprison the men who physically brokered the deal, tracking and dismantling the informal, trust-based financial network that facilitated the transfer of tens of millions of dollars remained an immense, ongoing challenge. The next phase of the investigation had to turn its attention to the other half of the trade, the exchange of cocaine for the weapons of terror. The money trail confirmed that Al-Qaeda's protectors were being paid in hard cash. But cash buys more than allegiance. It buys weapons. The FARC's cocaine generated the massive revenue needed to militarize the terror groups of the Sahel, allowing them to purchase sophisticated arms from regional black markets. The convergence of the cocaine superhighway and the illicit arms trade created a self-sustaining engine of global instability. The financial success of the FARC Al-Qaeda partnership provided the militants in the Sahel with something they desperately needed: access to high-grade military weaponry. The millions of dollars flowing through the Hawala networks were immediately channeled into the robust, highly corrupt arms, black markets that flourish in conflict zones. The transaction was simple. The cocaine generated the capital, and the capital acquired the tools of terror. The arms trade in West and North Africa is a complex, decentralized web fueled by decades of regional conflicts and porous borders. Following the destabilization of regimes across North Africa, massive stockpiles of government weaponry, including heavy machine guns, anti-tank rockets, and surface-to-air missiles were deliberately or accidentally released into the black market. The sheer volume of FARC cocaine profits gave Al-Qaeda affiliates, primarily AQIM, the purchasing power to acquire these weapons on a scale that few local insurgencies could match. The acquisition of these weapons had a devastating dual impact. First, it directly funded the merchants of war, furthering the cycle of violence. Second, and more critically, it allowed the narco-terror groups to upgrade their operational capabilities, shifting them from small-scale bandits to regional military threats. The new firepower allowed them to secure the cocaine superhighway with greater ruthlessness, deterring rival traffickers and local military patrols with superior arms. This militarization of the smuggling route further entrenched the dependency of the FARC on their terror partners for transit security. The nature of the arms acquired was strategic. They focused on equipment that maximized their ability to control territory and evade detection. Toyota Land Cruisers fitted with heavy machine guns, known as technicals, sophisticated communications equipment, and most alarmingly, man-portable air defense systems, MANPADS, which pose a direct threat to commercial and military aviation. The cocaine money was effectively buying the means to create a persistent, lawless safe haven across the Sahel. This exchange also represented a critical convergence of criminal expertise. The same logistical networks that successfully moved tons of cocaine from the coast of West Africa into the deep desert, the routes organized by men like Touré and secured by the militias of Abdel Rahman, were now used in reverse or in parallel to move weapons into the region. A convoy carrying a metric ton of cocaine north could easily return south with a payload of sophisticated arms, demonstrating the incredible efficiency and adaptability of this hybrid organization. The legal victory against the indicted individuals in New York was a triumph, but the flow of Kalashnikovs and RPGs, financed by the drug money, made it clear that the war was far from over. As long as the FARC could produce the cocaine and the European market could consume it, the financial engine would continue to turn, generating the capital needed to arm and sustain the terror groups. The spotlight now had to shift back to the weak link in the chain, the coastal nations of West Africa, which served as the unsecured arrival points for the tons of cocaine that began this deadly journey. Before the cocaine could reach the desert militias, it had to arrive on the African continent. The preferred entry point was often a fragile coastal state where corruption offered the path of least resistance. Investigators pinpointed one country that had become an unwilling, near-perfect logistical hub for the FARC: Guinea-Bissau, tragically dubbed the world's first true narco-state. Guinea-Bissau, a small nation on the West African coast, became the quintessential example of a narco-state in the mid-2000s. Its vulnerabilities: a small, underfunded military, endemic political instability, and a highly porous archipelago coastline, made it the perfect destination for the FARC's transatlantic cocaine shipments. Geographically, it sat at the end of the Highway 10 marine route, almost directly facing the coast of South America, making the sea voyage the most efficient way to cross the Atlantic. The cocaine arrived in Guinea-Bissau not by container ship, but typically via older commercial cargo vessels, high-speed fishing boats, or even converted private aircraft, landing on clandestine runways carved out of the bush. The local military and political elite, often low-paid and easily compromised, were systematically corrupted by the massive amounts of cash offered by the Latin American cartels. The price of silence and cooperation was immense, sometimes exceeding the country's annual national budget for security. In this environment, the FARC and other Latin American traffickers established a permanent, powerful base of operations. They did not need to run the operation themselves. They simply needed to secure the necessary political and military protection for unloading and initial warehousing. Local military figures became millionaire drug lords overnight. turning the country's institutions into an extension of the international criminal enterprise. The case of Haruna Touré, operating nearby in Ghana and coordinating transit through Mali, was part of this larger coastal-to-desert pipeline, but Guinea-Bissau represented the source of the physical payload's entry. The sheer volume of drugs passing through was staggering. At its peak, the UNODC estimated that significant percentages of the cocaine destined for Europe passed through West Africa, often landing first in places like Guinea-Bissau, before being consolidated and moved inland toward the Sahel routes protected by Al-Qaeda. The drugs would be consolidated in secure locations before being loaded onto the overland convoys that traveled the notorious cocaine superhighway toward Touré's network in the interior. The designation of narco-state meant that the country's sovereignty was severely compromised. Drug money flowed into political campaigns, purchased control over security forces, and ensured that any attempt by international agencies to investigate was met with official obstruction and threats. This created a secure, low-risk environment for the initial phase of the narco-terror supply chain. For the DEA and the international task forces, disrupting the coastal entry points proved to be an intelligence nightmare. You couldn't trust the local authorities you were supposed to be cooperating with. The corruption was too deep. The FARC had perfected a system of decentralized, non-state-controlled delivery, exploiting the very governance gaps that created terror safe havens, until the international community could stabilize these fragile coastal states. The floodgates for the FARC's cocaine and the funding for Al-Qaeda would remain wide open. The trail, however, did not begin in West Africa. It began with the FARC's reliance on one powerful, complicit state on the South American side. The FARC's cocaine reached West Africa from the Caribbean, but the bulk of the multi-ton shipments originated from one primary South American hub, the border region of Venezuela. The FARC used the complicity of high-level government officials to launch their product across the Atlantic, making a sovereign state the largest, most critical launchpad for the narco-terror supply chain. While the FARC controlled the coca fields and the laboratory production in Colombia, moving massive multi-ton shipments out of the country required high-level security and a friendly exit route. The FARC found their ideal partner in neighboring Venezuela, specifically utilizing the vast, poorly monitored border region and the cooperation of corrupt elements within the Venezuelan state security apparatus. This Venezuelan connection transformed the FARC's operational capacity. By moving the finished cocaine across the border, they could utilize Venezuelan territory and infrastructure, including airfields, military convoys, and coastal launch points, to dispatch their product directly across the Atlantic toward West Africa. This strategy not only bypassed Colombian interdiction efforts, but also conferred a veneer of sovereign protection on the shipments once they were in Venezuelan custody. The criminal enterprise that emerged from this partnership became known by U.S. law enforcement as the Cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles, a term used to describe the network of high-ranking Venezuelan military and political officials who allegedly participated in drug trafficking. The Suns referred to the military rank insignia worn by the officers involved. This official complicity ensured that FARC shipments were protected on the ground and cleared for export, allowing the cocaine to move swiftly and securely toward the West African drop zones like Guinea-Bissau. The methodology for transatlantic shipment was varied but massive in scale. Multi-ton loads were primarily shipped via large maritime vessels from remote, unauthorized ports along the Venezuelan coast. However, private aircraft, ranging from small propeller planes to modified commercial jets, also became a preferred method, often taking off from remote Venezuelan landing strips and crash-landing the cargo in the African desert, a spectacular but effective delivery method known as narco flights. This airborne transfer often delivered the payload directly into the hands of the desert networks, bypassing the coastal states entirely and saving time. The financial arrangement was mutually beneficial. The FARC paid handsomely for the protection and logistics provided by the Cartel of the Suns, generating vast, illicit wealth for the Venezuelan officials involved. This partnership demonstrates the geopolitical complexity of the narco-terror nexus. The FARC weaponized the corruption of a sovereign state to facilitate the funding of a designated foreign terrorist organization, AQIM. The international response to this state-level complicity was slow and politically complex. while individuals like Touré and Abdelrahman could be indicted and extradited. Prosecuting high-level officials within a sovereign state presented immense diplomatic and legal obstacles. However, the documentation from Operation Relentless and the follow-up investigation provided crucial intelligence, mapping the flow of cocaine from the jungles of Colombia through the Venezuelan military apparatus, across the Atlantic, and into the waiting arms of the terror network in the Sahel. The exposure of this route led to a global effort to disrupt the South American-West African connection, putting intense pressure on the most important transit hub for terror-funded drugs. The FARC's cocaine reached Europe via the African desert, but once it arrived in major ports like Rotterdam and Antwerp, it needed highly efficient distributors. The traditional gatekeepers of the European drug market, the Italian and Spanish mafias, were increasingly bypassed by a new, aggressive, and highly specialized set of groups, the Western Balkan criminal networks. The modern European cocaine market is dominated by efficiency, specialization, and ruthless competition. As the FARC diversified its supply chain via West Africa, the distribution networks receiving the product on the European end underwent a parallel evolution. The long-standing dominance of groups like the Italian Ndrangheta and traditional Iberian cartels was eroded by the rise of highly adaptable, transnational organizations originating from the Balkans. These new networks, often including the Montenegrin Kavač and Shkaljari clans, and various Albanian-speaking groups, became pivotal players. Their strength lay in their ability to establish direct, trusted relationships with South American suppliers, often bypassing West African brokers entirely for some shipments, but also serving as the key downstream recipients for the terror-protected payloads that came via the Sahel. They perfected the art of source-to-market control, ensuring higher profits and purer product for the final European consumer. The Balkan networks focused their efforts on infiltrating the logistics sector in the North Sea ports. The massive flow of legitimate trade through ports like Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Hamburg provided the perfect cover for their operations. They leveraged endemic corruption among crane operators, customs officials, and shipping company employees to efficiently extract multi-ton loads of cocaine from containers before they could be inspected. This specialization in port logistics made them invaluable partners for any global supplier, including those who had secured their transport via the FARC Al-Qaeda Nexus. Their operational structure was characterized by a high degree of flexibility and reliance on small, trusted, often ethnically tied units. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of older criminal syndicates, these groups could quickly adapt to shifting enforcement tactics and new maritime routes. This agility enabled them to maintain a consistent supply of cocaine across Western and Central Europe, dramatically increasing the purity and availability of the drug, and creating the exponential street value that incentivized the entire supply chain. The indictment and trial of Haruna Touré, which focused on the financing of terror, had an indirect but powerful impact on these European distributors. The exposure of the terror financing connection meant that the cocaine they were handling carried not just drug risk, but severe terrorism risk. Any future partnership with the African route would expose the Balkan groups to the same anti-terrorism laws used to convict Touré and Abdelrahman, adding a new layer of complexity to their risk assessment. Ultimately, the profits generated by these European distributors completed the global criminal loop. The cash they paid for the cocaine was the exact funding that flowed through the Hawala system to arm the militias in the Sahel. This established a direct line of causation. The rising demand for cocaine in European cities created the financial imperative that fueled jihadist violence thousands of miles away. The next focus needed to be on the most tragic consequence of this global supply chain: the civilian victims caught in the crossfire. The narrative of narco-terror is often dominated by names like FARC, Al-Qaeda, and Haruna Touré, but the primary victims of their profit-driven partnership are rarely named: the ordinary citizens of the Sahel. The drug money that financed the desert militias directly fueled a humanitarian crisis, creating a cycle of systemic violence, displacement, and lawlessness across West Africa. The violence and instability inherent in the narco-terror nexus had a profound and immediate impact on the communities along the cocaine superhighway. The Sahel, already vulnerable due to poverty and weak governance, was transformed into a violent battleground where the drug trade became the dominant economic and military force. The militias, led by men like Idris Abdulrahman, flush with weapons purchased with FARC money, enforced their control over the trafficking routes through systemic brutality. Villages that resisted, refused to harbor the convoys, or dared to cooperate with local government forces, were subject to terrifying reprisals, including raids, kidnapping, and execution. The money generated by the drug protection tax was used to purchase the impunity of the militias, allowing them to operate above the law and terrorize civilian populations without consequence. The humanitarian fallout was immense. The surge in violence led to mass internal displacement. Farmers and nomadic herders were forced to abandon their land and ancestral roots, seeking refuge in already overcrowded and under-resourced urban centers, exacerbating food shortages and creating a deeper refugee crisis across Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The destruction of local economic activity as legitimate commerce was replaced by the illicit drug trade, further destabilized the region, creating a perfect recruiting ground for the very extremist groups that were causing the chaos. The narco-terrorists intentionally exploited existing ethnic and tribal tensions. By funding certain groups and empowering them with advanced weaponry, they deepened local conflicts, ensuring a continuous supply of instability that distracted local governments and international peacekeepers. The objective was not just to move drugs, but to maintain a state of controlled anarchy, where their criminal enterprise could thrive unchallenged. Furthermore, the corruption bought by the drug money undermined every facet of civil society. Local police were powerless or complicit. Judges and politicians were compromised. This created a sense of despair and injustice that further alienated the civilian population from their own governments, making the promise of the radicalized groups, however distorted, seem like a viable alternative to state failure. The drugs that enriched the FARC and the Balkan cartels directly led to the collapse of governance in the African transit zones. The international community, focused largely on the European destination and the Colombian source, was often slow to grasp the severity of the crisis unfolding in the middle of the supply chain. The human cost was measurable. Tens of thousands displaced, lives lost to terror-related violence, and the wholesale failure of governance in key strategic states. The trial in New York may have secured convictions for the brokers, but it did nothing to immediately alleviate the suffering of the people whose lives were destroyed by the millions of dollars that passed through their desert. The true long-term threat of this model was not just in the drugs or the terror attacks, but in the creation of vast ungovernable zones where the hybrid model could replicate and expand. The FARC Al-Qaeda indictment proved that the narco-terror model worked. This successful blueprint for self-financing terror did not go unnoticed by rival extremist organizations. The new hybrid model of using drug profits for terror operations began to replicate globally, adopted by groups ranging from Hezbollah to the most brutal affiliates of the Islamic State, proving the true danger of the initial nexus. The financial success, demonstrated by the FARC Al-Qaeda partnership in the Sahel, provided a chilling new template for terrorist financing worldwide. Historically, extremist groups relied on state sponsors, wealthy donors, or localized crimes like kidnapping and protection rackets. The narco-terror model, however, offered a path to financial autonomy by tapping into the multi-billion-dollar global drug market. Rival groups were quick to study and adapt this blueprint. Most notably, affiliates of the Islamic State, ISIS, began to integrate themselves into illicit economies. While ISIS's initial financing relied heavily on oil smuggling and extortion in Iraq and Syria, its successor franchises and decentralized affiliates, such as ISIS Khorasan, ISIS-K, and various groups in Libya and the Sinai, pivoted to drug trafficking as their caliphate collapsed. They recognized that controlling a piece of the drug supply chain, either taxing it, protecting it, or moving it themselves, provided sustainable, low-risk revenue. In North Africa, for instance, groups affiliated with the Islamic State were accused of profiting from the trafficking of synthetic opiates like tramadol and traditional hashish, moving them across the region to fund their operations. The principle was identical to the FARC Al-Qaeda dynamic: leverage local territorial control and military force to secure a high-value commodity, and in return, gain the financial means to perpetuate the conflict. This adoption of the hybrid model was not limited to the traditional Sunni jihadist sphere. Organizations like Hezbollah, the Shia militant group and political party, have been heavily implicated in complex global drug trafficking operations, including the movement of cocaine and the laundering of proceeds through various commercial enterprises worldwide. Their financial networks utilize the same lack of paper trail and informal currency transfer systems, like Hawala, that had been critical to the FARC Al-Qaeda partnership. The global replication of the model demonstrated the urgency of the threat. The indictment in New York had exposed one critical node, but the underlying mechanism was now active across different continents and ideological lines. From the poppy fields of Afghanistan and the Golden Crescent, where groups like the Taliban financed their insurgency through the massive opium trade, to the crystal meth labs of Mexico, which fund ongoing violence, the fusion of organized crime and terrorism became the standard for modern militant groups. This shift changed the fundamental nature of counterterrorism. It was no longer enough to track training camps and ideology. It became a financial investigation, requiring specialized teams of financial analysts and counter-narcotics agents to follow the money. The lesson of Operation Relentless was that to defeat the terror threat, one had to dismantle the drug cartel that was funding it. The failure to adequately address the structural weaknesses of the fragile states that enable this trade, however, ensured its continuous replication. The focus had to turn to the complicity that allowed the trade to flourish: the deliberate political corruption. The FARC could not have shipped cocaine across the Atlantic, and Haruna Touré could not have secured it across the desert, without one critical component: systemic political corruption. The narco-terror pipeline did not merely exploit weak states. It actively bought off government officials, police forces, and military leaders, transforming key transit nations into willingly complicit environments. The narco-terror model thrives in a landscape of compromised governance. The massive guaranteed profits from FARC cocaine provided the hybrid criminal enterprise with a powerful tool: the ability to buy loyalty and silence from key personnel within the governments of the transit states. The annual illicit revenue generated by the cocaine superhighway often dwarfed the legal gross domestic product of the most fragile West African countries, making government officials often poorly paid, highly susceptible to bribery. Corruption was not a side effect of the trade, it was an integral part of the business plan. In coastal states like Guinea-Bissau, the FARC's money ensured that military generals protected the clandestine airstrips and ports where the cocaine was offloaded. Inland, in states like Mali and Niger, the flow of cash paid off local mayors, customs officials, and border patrol agents to ensure the safe passage of the heavily armed convoys secured by Idris Abdelrahman's militias. This network of complicity was the ultimate insurance policy for the multi-ton shipments. The consequences of this systemic corruption were devastating to legitimate governance. Drug money was used to finance political campaigns and coups, installing leaders who owed their power and allegiance not to their citizens, but to the cartels and the terror groups. This cycle hollowed out the state, guaranteeing that the institutions meant to enforce the rule of law were instead serving the interests of transnational organized crime. For the populace, this destroyed any remaining trust in government, contributing to the instability that fuels extremism. The intelligence gathered from Operation Relentless provided the DEA and the Justice Department with detailed information on this political rot, exposing the names of high-level officials who were on the narco-terror payroll. However, the U.S. government faced immense diplomatic challenges in acting on this information. Extraditing a drug broker like Haruna Touré was difficult. Prosecuting or sanctioning a sitting general or government minister in a sovereign African state was a political minefield. The long-term strategy had to evolve from simple seizures and arrests to a comprehensive plan to strengthen the institutions of these vulnerable states. It required training local police and judicial systems to resist corruption, providing economic alternatives to the illicit trade, and creating the political will to prosecute their own citizens who profited from the terror trade. The failure of governance provided the breathing room for the narco-terror nexus to evolve and flourish. The FARC's cocaine money bought not just weapons and silence, But time for Al-Qaeda affiliates to consolidate their power, expand their influence, and plot attacks beyond the region. The fight against the narco-terror model, therefore, was fundamentally a battle against corruption. As long as a government official was willing to take a bribe to look the other way, the cocaine superhighway would remain open. The next step was to examine the global cooperative response to this unprecedented threat. The FARC Al-Qaeda indictment proved the existence of an autonomous, self-financing terror supply chain. The global security apparatus could not rely on old models. The response required unprecedented cooperation between counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, and financial intelligence agencies from the US, Europe, and Latin America. The new war on terror would be fought on the sea, in the desert, and in the digital corridors of global finance. The threat posed by the narco-terror nexus demanded a comprehensive and coordinated global strategy. No single nation could defeat a decentralized enemy operating across 3 continents. The U.S. response, catalyzed by the success of Operation Relentless and the subsequent convictions, focused on a multi-pronged attack: interdiction, sanctions, and capacity building. Interdiction efforts were dramatically ramped up in the key transit zones. This meant increasing the naval presence in the eastern Atlantic and the Gulf of Guinea to intercept the multi-ton cocaine shipments coming from South America. Cooperation between the U.S. Coast Guard, NATO, and European navies focused on the notorious Highway 10 corridor. In the desert, mobile DEA and international law enforcement teams began working with local forces to target the overland convoys, leading to significant seizures of both cocaine and military-grade weaponry. Crucially, the Treasury Department and the Office of Foreign Assets Control (OFAC) began aggressively using financial sanctions. By designating key individuals, businesses, and entire networks as either foreign terrorist organizations or specially designated narcotics traffickers, they sought to freeze assets, prohibit any U.S. entity from doing business with them, and effectively cut them off from the global financial system. This was a direct attack on the Hawala system and the official corruption that shielded the trade. The long-term success, however, relied on capacity building in the most vulnerable states. The U.S. and EU launched extensive programs to train and equip local law enforcement, judicial officials, and border forces in West Africa. The goal was not just to catch drug traffickers, but to empower governments to investigate, prosecute, and dismantle the complex money laundering and corruption networks that the narco-terror groups relied upon. This approach recognized that political stability was the first line of defense against the hybrid threat. The strategy also targeted the source, the FARC's cocaine production. International pressure and direct diplomatic engagement with Colombia and its neighbors aimed to reduce the output of coca and disrupt the final logistical link provided by groups like the Cartel of the Suns. The entire global community had to accept that the war on drugs and the war on terror were functionally the same war, requiring a unified legal and military approach. Despite these concerted efforts, the challenge remained immense. The criminal networks proved highly adaptable, constantly shifting their routes from the Atlantic to new African transit zones, and from the North Sea ports to other European entry points. The vastness of the Sahel and the depth of corruption provided an enduring operational advantage to the hybrid groups. While the individual arrests and the public exposure of the Nexus were vital, the financial engine remained resilient. The only way to measure true success was by looking at the long-term impact on global security. The conviction secured in New York established a critical legal precedent, but the war against the narco-terror nexus is a permanent one. The hybrid model of crime as financing is too lucrative, too decentralized, and too adaptable to be dismantled by single arrests. The true threat is the model's enduring resilience, its ability to evolve and threaten global security long after the FARC's original involvement has waned. The case of the FARC and Al-Qaeda's shared logistics was a snapshot in time, a unique moment where a Colombian insurgency and a global terror group formally merged their operations for profit and security. However, the real legacy of the indictment is the creation of a permanent threat model, the self-financing terror organization. Even as the FARC demobilized following peace accords and Al-Qaeda's central command was weakened, the financial mechanism they pioneered lives on, adopted by successor criminal and extremist groups worldwide, The flow of illicit revenue from drug trafficking remains the single most important destabilizing factor in West Africa and the Sahel. The criminal infrastructure, the logistics networks, the Hawala channels, the corrupted officials, and the militarized desert routes did not vanish with the arrests of Touré or Abdelrahman. They were simply taken over by the next generation of hybrid criminal terror organizations, stronger, smarter, and operating with a blueprint for success that had already been tested and proven. The lessons learned by global law enforcement are now foundational to counter-terrorism strategy. Follow the money first. The financial intelligence gathered from the indictment revealed that attacking the drug profit margin is a more effective long-term strategy than simply targeting terrorist training camps. By disrupting the cocaine supply chain by increasing interdiction at sea, sanctioning corrupt officials, and targeting the European distributors, the flow of cash to the militants can be choked off. The economic vulnerability of the transit states remains the primary challenge. As long as poverty and weak governance persist in West Africa, criminal networks will find willing partners for corruption. The $2,000 per kilogram protection fee may seem simple, but in the context of failing economies, it is an irresistible financial incentive that trumps allegiance to the state. The only way to truly secure the cocaine superhighway is through massive long-term investments in political stability and economic development in the Sahel. The story of the FARC and Al-Qaeda is a stark warning. It proved that in the 21st century, the greatest threats to global security are no longer purely ideological or purely criminal. They are hybrid enterprises that view violence and terror as necessary tools for securing profit. The indictment against Touré was a crucial victory, but it only exposed the tip of a vast iceberg, a system that has now gone autonomous, replicating itself wherever poverty and opportunity intersect. The war against narco-terror is a continuous battle for sovereignty, stability, and the integrity of the global financial system. The next and final segment will summarize the ultimate stakes of this convergence. The indictment of Haruna Touré, Umar Issa, and Idris Abdelrahman was the critical moment that defined this new era of asymmetrical threat. Their convictions in a New York courtroom provided the necessary legal framework to fight the hybrid enemy. But the investigation, Operation Relentless, did more than secure prison sentences. It provided a detailed map of a global threat ecosystem. The core principle of the ecosystem was the weaponization of profit. The immense guaranteed revenue from the European cocaine market, up to €80,000 per kilogram, provided a financial engine that far surpassed traditional terror financing methods. The $2,000 per kilogram protection fee paid to the terror-affiliated militias guaranteed not just safe passage but the continuous industrial-scale funding for arms acquisition, recruitment, and destabilization in the Sahel. This money empowered the extremist groups to move beyond regional insurgency to become global security threats. The supply chain relied on three critical vulnerabilities: the source protection provided by corrupt officials in South American states, the transit security provided by terror militias across the African desert, and the demand maintained by organized crime networks in Europe. The collapse of governance in key transit zones, exemplified by the Narco-State of Guinea-Bissau, ensured that the entire pipeline remained viable and low risk for the FARC. The result was a catastrophic human cost, measured in the displacement of civilians and the empowerment of jihadist groups that now pose an enduring threat across the region. The global response, while robust, must continue to evolve. It requires a permanent commitment to financial intelligence and sanctioning the institutions and individuals who enable the trade. The legal precedent set by the U.S. using anti-terror statutes against drug traffickers remains the most powerful tool in the arsenal. However, the long-term solution lies not in more seizures, but in building resilient states in West Africa, governments strong enough to resist corruption and provide a legitimate economic alternative to the illicit trade. The convergence of the Colombian drug empire and the global terror network fundamentally changed the nature of organized crime. It proved that ideology is negotiable when the profits are high enough. The legacy of the FARC Al-Qaeda Nexus is a world where every kilogram of cocaine sold is a direct investment in global instability and the arming of terror. Understanding this blueprint is the first step toward dismantling the autonomous, self-replicating narco-terror threat that defines our current security landscape. The battle against the narco-terror nexus continues every day, far from the headlines. The integrity of our global financial system and the safety of vulnerable communities depend on the continuous vigilance of specialized agents worldwide. We urge you to support organizations dedicated to financial intelligence, anti-corruption, and capacity building in West Africa. Education is the first line of defense. Share this investigation, discuss the true cost of the drug trade, and demand accountability from governments who allow these criminal enterprises to flourish. Your awareness is a force multiplier in a hidden war that affects us all. Cinematic digital photorealism, neo-noir, heavy grain, deep contrast, desaturated palette with selective red accents. A stark, dramatic close-up of a pair of official government hands, DEA or UNODC, handing over a thick stack of training manuals or financial reports to a pair of African hands in a handshake. The red accent highlights the shared gesture of cooperation and the title of the document, Financial Intelligence. The story of the FARC's cocaine and Al-Qaeda's protection is a testament to the new reality of the 21st century threat. The world has changed. Criminal and ideological forces are now a single, highly motivated, and self-financing entity. The individuals exposed by the indictment Toure, Abdulrahman, and their FARC partners are behind bars. But the model they perfected continues to operate in the shadows, waiting for the next vulnerability, the next weak government, and the next surge in consumer demand. We owe a debt of gratitude to the courageous undercover agents, the relentless prosecutors, and the countless anonymous victims whose sacrifice helped expose this nexus. This is a story about the devastating power of money and the eternal struggle between those who seek to build legitimate structures and those who seek to buy and exploit the chaos. The financial war is the new front line of global security. Stay vigilant,